So that's set for recording. Okay, so right. Again, this is the smallest crowd we've had, so I don't know why people get sick of it, or people don't like work at heights. But we'll go directly to discuss about this. So, work at heights. The overview is we're going to do an introduction. We're going to look at legislation guidance. We're going to look at certification and inspection. We're going to look at work at height equipment and a safe system of work for work at heights. Now, you know, in reality, we could spend 2-3 days on this. There's so much information. So what I've done is I've broken it down into the key bits of information and then key guidance that's available to you. And if you have any queries or whatever, you can go back to me with regard to it. So first thing is, what is work at height? Work at height is any place, including the place at or above ground level, where a person could be injured if they fell from that place. So there's no set height for work at height. It's any height at which a person can get injured. And it also includes access and egress to a place of work. So it means, you know, climbing up to get to a place of work, or climbing down to get to a place of work, or climbing down from a place of work. That's classed as work at heights. Examples of work activities. Hold on, we've got Dorina coming in. So she should land in now in a second. Examples of work activities that are classed as work at heights: working on trestles, working on flat roofs, erecting false work or formwork, working on a ladder, working at ground level or adjacent to an excavator, working on formwork within an excavation, working near or adjacent to fragile materials, working on the back of a vehicle. So Dorina's just joined from Virginia Transport, and Adrian, you would have people working off vehicles as well. So that's classed as work at heights. So let's look at, I suppose, information about fatalities and accidents. So 2020, this is from the HSA accident statistics document they produced last year. And you can see here, 7 people fell from heights. Loss of control over means of transport, 16 is quite high. Falls of an object from above, again, so somebody can be working above and drop something, or something falls off something and hits something. Victims entering a dangerous area, yeah, or fall of an object from below, or dragging victim down. So that can be a fall from height as well, where someone was dragged down. So in reality, when we look at the figures falls from height, it actually is 9, because 2 people were pulled down to their deaths, unfortunately, from a height. So when we look here, we look at, well, where are they occurring? Agricultural, forestry, and fishing, 3 fatalities, and construction, 4 fatalities. That gives us our 7. Okay. So when we look at other types of industry we have here, manufacturing, we haven't had any fatalities from falls from heights in 2020. Okay, and when we look at transportation and storage, again, we don't have any falls from heights that resulted in fatalities, either in transport. Okay, looking at legislation. So the legislation is quite broad when it comes to work at heights. We start with the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act and the specific employer and employee duties, which you should all be familiar with in terms of the duty to ensure a safe work environment, etc. The duty of the employer to manage risk under Section 19. The duty of the employer to provide appropriate training, instruction, information, and supervision. So if somebody's working at heights, they should have appropriate training, instruction, information, and there should be appropriate supervision in place. So that's, I suppose, the broad, I suppose, legislation. When we start talking about, there's also the principles of prevention. And this is, I suppose, you should be aware again, the hierarchy of risk management. So we try to avoid risk, and then we put control measures that reduce risk. I've laid out the various types of machinery based on a hierarchical basis. So the lowest risk first and the highest risk last. So if we go through all the various types of work at heights, you'll see them arranged in that level. You can argue on a couple of them which goes before, you know, is that a higher risk than this? Again, it is subjective to a degree, but it's also based on the particular activities that people have been engaged in. The Safety, Health and Welfare at Work General Application Regulations, 2007 to 2021. This is where there's a specific section relating to working at heights, and it's part 4 called Work at Height. There's also another section that relates to the use of work equipment, which is part 2, chapter 2. And in that, it relates to things like suitability of equipment, inspection of equipment, and competencies of individuals working on equipment. Then there's a Schedule 1, which outlines what the inspection regimes are for work equipment. And again, I'll go through that as we proceed through this. Then we got the Safety, Health and Welfare Work Construction Regulations 213 to 220. And again, are these applicable? Well, if we think of who we have here, so Emer from a pharmaceutical type background where there will be construction activities, yes. Adrian, you're involved in construction activities all the time. And Dorina, you may have occasions where there are construction activities happening. And again, they would Work at Heights falls under that. So in the construction regulations, it classifies what we call particular risks that you have to take account of. And one of those particular risks are falls from heights that have to be assessed and effective controls put in place. There's also temporary works. Temporary works could be scaffolding or access platforms that are temporary in nature to facilitate the construction. Again, these fall under the requirements of the legislation. And then there's the inspection of work equipment called a GA3, which is a weekly inspection of work at height equipment. So your ladders, your MUPs, your harnesses, etc. So let's look into the legislation now in terms of the specific legislation regarding work at heights from the general application regulations. It's part 4, an employer's duty to avoid work at height where this is reasonably practicable. So we try to avoid it if we can. Use work equipment or other measures to prevent falls where you cannot avoid working at heights. So if we are working at heights, we have to have measures in place to reduce the risk of falling. And where you cannot eliminate the risk of a fall, use work equipment or other measures to minimize the distance and consequences of a fall. So, you know, minimize the distance and consequence of a fall. So for example, if somebody's working on a roof, you may put scaffolding underneath the roof so that if they fall through the roof, they fall off the scaffolding, which is only a foot below or whatever. That's an example. Here's an example of a road tanker. And you'll see a lot of them will have the ladders to gain access up to the top. But the question is, can that be avoided? Can you do that work without having to get somebody up on top? And yes, there are systems now for lorries for checking various aspects. Usually the loading and volume, and that can be done from the side or from the back now, as opposed to having to get somebody up on top. All work at height is properly planned, organised, supervised, and carried out. The place where work at height is done is safe. So a good example would be a fragile roof. So somebody goes up to work on a roof, and the roof may not be safe, and people think it's a safe work area, and they walk on the roof or a skylight and fall through the skylight. All work at height takes account of weather conditions. Again, wind is a significant one for work at heights. Frost and cold is a significant one for work at heights, especially for climbing and it's steel. And also we're on to roofs that can be very frosty and slippery, etc. We tend to heed the weather warnings as issued by Met Éireann, and we also tend to, I suppose, take account of local type wind situations where there may be gusting or excessive winds that may not necessarily be forecast. It's just be mindful of local conditions that can adversely affect work at heights. Those involved in work at height are instructed and trained. So there's various types of training out there and various requirements, which we'll go through. When I'm going through the various aspects of the various equipment, we'll talk about what training is in place or should be in place. Equipment for work at height is properly inspected. So there's two things. There's certification, which is your 6-monthly cert on work at height equipment, which we're going to talk about. And then there's your weekly inspection of work at height equipment. So, and obviously the person doing the, first of all, the certification inspection, they have to have appropriate competence in that field. And the person doing the weekly inspection, they should be familiar with the issues associated with, for example, if they're inspecting a ladder, they should know what to look for when they're inspecting a ladder to make sure that they can sign off on that. The risk from fragile surfaces are properly controlled, and injury from falling objects is prevented. So try to prevent items from falling down. And that's where you might have toe boards or netting around scaffolding, or toe boards on mutes and mobile scaffolds and things like that. Again, we've developed these pictures from incidents that have occurred over time. The one with the vehicle, and this is another example where somebody fell through. And again, in a lot of cases, unfortunately, the injuries are quite significant or worse from a fall. So the employer's duty requires employers to carry out risk assessment for all work conducted at height and to put in place arrangements. So a risk assessment, so assess the risk, what is the likelihood of an accident occurring, and what is the potential severity of that. And we put in place arrangements for eliminating or minimizing the risks from working at height. So how do we reduce that risk? Have we got a safe system of work for organizing and performing work at height? So, safe system of work, or a method statement, or a safe procedure. A safe system for selecting suitable work equipment to perform work at height. And, it's a common one. A lot of accidents we would deal with tend to be off ladders. And when we go and investigate the ladder, we look at the ladder and we look at the height that they're working at, and we established it very quickly that the ladder isn't suitable for the height at which the work has been operated, or work has been done. It's a common occurrence. So it's a failure at the first step. Make sure the equipment is suitable for the work intended. And if it's not the correct height or size, then you have to get appropriate equipment that is the right height or size. Safe system for protecting people from the work at height. So if you are working at height, obviously, if there's people below, or pedestrians or others who may be walking, close to, adjacent, underneath, then you have to consider how we're going to protect those. And in some cases, it may be a case of cordoning off an area, or putting a signaler in place to stop work while people are passing. But there has to be some level of control to reduce that risk. There are other ways to try to reduce risk, like putting tethers on equipment. So, for example, if someone using a hand drill, it's tethered to their harness or to the body. So if it falls out of their hand, it's not going to fall off. A helmet is a good example of where helmets fall and can injure people. So the helmet should be the right type helmet, which is what we call a low peak helmet, and also has got strapping to prevent it from falling off. Of course, we're down to individuals and individuals using the equipment correctly. These are, as we call, live actual pictures from sites that we would put up here, where a person has got the wrong size ladder and is trying to do the work safely. And yes, 99 times out of 100, or 999 times out of 1,000, they'll get away with it. But once they'll miss their step or lose their balance and fall. And what does that result in? Well, at best, a broken wrist, bump to the head, etc. At worst, yeah, you might be very unlucky and crack your spine, and that's the end of it. You don't know. We had one case the latter end of last year, where a guy fell and fractured his skull and was in intensive care for, I think, 2.5 weeks. I believe he is back at work, but I think he was lucky that he didn't have more permanent injuries. Employee requirements: comply with these regulations. So the employees have to comply, protect their own safety and health, as well as the safety and health of others. So they've got a duty of care to themselves and anybody who's working around them. Ensure that they're not under the influence of an intoxicant, etc., which is normal. Cooperate with the employer with regard to safety, so follow rules, procedures, etc. Not to engage in improper conduct that could endanger the safety and health of others. So again, use the equipment as directed and as per the manufacturing instructions, and participate in appropriate training where required. And then make proper use of all the equipment, etc., so that it doesn't increase risk. So proper use means using the ladder rightly. Improper use means not using the ladder correctly. So selection and use of work equipment. So, depending on what you're doing, there's a guardrail system which protects people. It's a fixed scaffold, it's a mobile scaffold, it's a mobile elevated working platform like a scissor lift or a boom lift. it's a podium ladder, it's a harness for restraint or a harness for fall rest, or an A-frame ladder. I'm going to show you, I'm going to go through all of these with you. A straight height ladder, yeah. At the end of the day, whatever work equipment is being used, we're relying on the person being competent, and competent is having sufficient training, knowledge, and experience for the work that they are engaged to do. And not having competent puts people at risk. Again, another example, this is a wooden A-frame ladder, and the guy is right at the very, very top and working away. And again, that is, it's totally unsafe. And if the individual falls, we're in a bit of bother. So legislative guidance. Thankfully, there's a load of very, very good guidance out there. So we got the Guide to General Application Regulations Part 4, Work at Heights. We got the Guide to General Application Regulations Part 2, Chapter 2, Use of Work Equipment. These are HSA guides to the specifically very detailed, very plain, very sort of clear in terms of plain English. There are two codes of practice that we would look at with regard to Work at Heights. Code of practice for access working scaffolds, and that includes mobile scaffolds. And a code of practice for safety in roof work. So there are two guides that are, again, very, very detailed, very, very clear, and it's very easy to establish what is the requirement and how things should be done right. There are some additional guidance documents. So the HSA have provided guidance on the use of MUPs, mobile elevator working platforms. They provided a work at height poster. It's kind of the top 7 tips to when conducting safe work at heights. They have an info sheet on work at height in agriculture, because agriculture is probably the highest risk workplace there is at the moment. And they have one for the use of ladders. They've also got other information. Again, here's an example. This is a podium ladder. I'm going to talk about that now in a minute. The podium ladder is much safer and is preferred ahead of the A-frame ladders. Again, we talk about that. So all of that guidance document is available. If you want, just drop us an email, and Aisling, or copy me or Aisling, and Aisling will send you all of those documents. They're available online, but we have them in a group, so we can send them on to you. Again, very helpful when looking at policies and procedures and developing policies and procedures, or reviewing policies and procedures, or the management of contractors if you're unsure of certain question or query. The details in terms of requirements tend to be in those documents. So work at height certification and inspection. So this falls under part 2 of the of chapter 2 of the General Application Regulations. And inspection of work equipment. An employer shall ensure that inspections are carried out by a competent person. So now there's a couple of cases going through the courts. One in particular, that's probably going to highlight the importance of ensuring that work equipment is appropriately inspected by a competent person. So, for example, if I'm going to inspect and certify a MUP, a mobile elevator working platform, well, I need a fair amount of qualifications and training to prove that I have sufficient competence to do that. Because there is in a MUP, there are structural parts, there are hydraulic parts, there are electronic parts, and electrical, all of which are involved in safety aspects of it. So I need to be conversant with all of those when inspecting and checking for certification purposes. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. The person has to be competent, and usually they will have an engineering background, possibly, or a significant background in machinery with certification through one of the providers of what we call valid certification to demonstrate competencies in the evaluation of equipment and associated systems, so they can sign off on that. Okay. Obviously, it is difficult, and the issue arises and will arise in one of these court cases, which I'm very, very, very familiar with, unfortunately. But the person who inspected a piece of equipment that failed, that resulted in the fatality of a couple of people, that person has got to prove that they're competent, and and you know that's up to them too. And the employer has got to prove that they are that they engage a competent person to do that work, and that's very difficult, you know. You know, that was a particular case. I'm not mentioning any names on it, but that a particular case that's going through the course currently. The results of inspections carried out are recorded and kept available for 5 years from the date of the inspection. For inspections by an inspector, and access to these records are made available. So this is where the HSA want to have access to inspection records. This is the 6 monthly inspection records of equipment. There is weekly inspection of work at height equipment, which is a GA3. And again, you keep those, and you know you don't have a requirement to keep them for 5 years, but you have a requirement to prove that you're doing it on an ongoing basis. So weekly. There's an exception. Scaffolds can be more frequent than weekly if subject to harsh weather or changed or altered or moved. Then they have to be re-inspected. When work equipment is used in another place of work, it is accompanied by evidence of the last inspection carried out. So again, the inspection, the 7-day inspection, that should be done continually. So if somebody comes onto site, it should be inspected then and inspected every 7 days. Obviously, if it comes onto site, then you need to have access to the 6 monthly inspection certificate, which sometimes is with the equipment. So that's the HSA's GA1, which is your 6-month inspection cert. Okay. Now they don't all look like that, but they will record the fact that they're a GA1 or in compliance with the general application regulations, etc. Maintenance. An employer should ensure that throughout its working life, equipment is kept by means of adequate maintenance at a level such that it complies with the provisions of these regulations. So what they say with regard to equipment and work at height equipment is that you must comply with the manufacturer's instructions and guidance with regard to maintenance. You also must comply with the statutory obligation with regard to inspection and testing. Where possible, maintenance operations are carried out when the work equipment is shut down, and where it is not possible, appropriate protections measures are taken for the carrying out of such operations, or such operations are carried out outside the area of danger. So maintenance operations are supposed to be done in a controlled and safe area, but that's not always the case, because sometimes maintenance can occur at a location where the machine has stopped or has broken down, or you know, so the work has to be done in that area. And if that's the case, well then obviously make sure the area is safe. Work equipment is maintained in such a way as to reduce the risk to users of the work equipment and to other persons at work. So when you are maintaining the work, maintaining your work equipment, it must be safe. And a maintenance log for all equipment, or especially work at height equipment, has to be maintained. The exception would be scaffolding, because scaffolding is made up of components, and components then by their nature can change from one scaffold to another. So a scaffold is a complete unit with all the components, not individual units. So this is the example of a forklift truck. It could be a MUP or anything else, but it tells you what should be done. That's what the manufacturers say should be done. So it should be done in compliance with the manufacturers. Obviously, if there's an accident, then the HSA will come and check and see, are you maintaining it as you should be maintaining it? And did the lack of maintenance impact or cause the potential for an accident to occur? So a GA1, 6 monthly inspection by a competent person, and a GA3 is a weekly inspection of work at height equipment. And that's an example of the HSA's GA3 form. Okay, you can adapt it, and people have changed different. We have got different types of forms for different types of equipment. And if you're looking for a specific form, for example, for a scissor lift or a boom lift or a forklift or whatever, then let us know. We'll pass out that form to you. Okay. So what the law says is, can we protect everybody where possible from work at heights as opposed to protect an individual? This is an example: parapet wall on a roof. It means that everybody's protected, not just one person. So when we look at the hierarchy of controls, this is the least amount of risk for somebody working on at heights, because they're working on a roof, but there's a parapet wall in place. There can also be a guardrail system, be it a permanent guardrail system or a temporary guardrail system that can do the same thing. Obviously, a temporary one is more of a risk because it may be subject to fault or damage. There are specific heights of the top of the guardrail. So your top rail should be a minimum of 950. Your mid rail should be in a position so there's no gap greater than 450 between the mid rail and the top, and the mid rail and the bottom. And if there's a toe board, the toe board should be 600. It should be 150. Apology, which is 6 inches. Fixed scaffold. Your next good control is a fixed scaffold. So scaffold come in, they build a scaffold, they're trained, they certify the scaffold, and you go and you work on the scaffold. Guardrails are in place at the correct heights, your 950, 470, and your 150, and it is a safe place to work, provided people stay inside the scaffold, obviously. Mobile elevator working platforms, this is next, and we've got various options with these, from your scissor lifts to your boom lifts to your what we call micro single person lifts, and they're very good to work on. People have to be trained to use them. Now, there's no what we call, although some companies might want IPAF training, it's International Powered Access Federation training, but that's not a requirement in Ireland, although some companies might want it. Someone who's been trained by a competent person, the HSA or SOLAS are yet to bring out a certified or a CSCS type. That's SOLAS with the HSA. They would decide that it should be part of CSCS. It was due a number of years ago to go down that road, but it never did. Now, there is an added issue with regard to the use of mobile working platforms, that people have to wear harnesses when in them. So people should be trained in the use of harness. The harness in a MUPE is designed to retain you in that MUPE to protect you from falling out. Yeah, so it is a restrained type to keep you in the MUPE. Mobile scaffold is next. So mobile scaffold is very handy, very useful. Now, what does the law say about them? If the platform is 2 meters or higher, then the person erecting it must be CSCS qualified. If the platform is under 2 meters, then appropriate training, not CSCS, but appropriate training by a competent person is required. Okay. A harness shouldn't be used in a mobile scaffold, because a harness, the risk is that you take the scaffold down if you fell out of the harness, out of the scaffold. You'll see there's an upper rail, there's a mid rail, and there's a toe board. Again, it should be minimum 950, the mid rail with a gap no greater than 470, and the 150 at the rail. You'll also see there's some outriggers in place as well. And again, the person who is trained would know how to set up those outriggers depending on the type of activity that's being done and the height at which the tower is going. That's a narrow span mobile tower. You can get what we call a wide span, which is double the width. And you've got various different types of them out there, but they're very safe if set up correctly and built correctly. Podium ladder. This is our next type. I've chosen this picture to show you the different heights of the platforms, so that people know, you have to select the right podium ladder for the right activity. And this is the difference between a podium ladder and an A-frame ladder. An A-frame ladder, you're supposed to, the top of your waist should be at the top of the ladder. That's as high as you go on an A-frame ladder. But what happens is, if they can't reach, they go up a step or go up to the top step. The podium ladder doesn't give you that opportunity. There's a platform and that's it. So you're standing at whatever. And this is from ladders.ie, so we're by Irish if you can. And this gives you examples of the various platform heights, where you're standing on 4 foot, you're standing on 5 foot, you're standing on 6 foot, you're standing on 7 foot. And if you're standing on let's say the 2 meter one there, 2 meters means that I have a working height of 3.5 meters comfortably. So it's understanding your working height of a particular podium ladders. Very, very safe, because they provide effective guardrail around you as you work. Roof restraint systems. So this is a system on roofs, and it's designed to prevent you from falling off. So it restrains you from getting in a position where you can fall. Very, very good. However, we're always relying on a person to ensure they do what they're supposed to do by tying on to the lifeline that's in place. Okay, and where you have a reliance on people, it's less effective than a mechanical or a physical barrier. So for example, a parapet wall is much better, and a guardrail system is much better than that restraint system there. Fixed ladders. So you have fixed ladders. Again, these get you access up to somewhere or allow you to climb down. Again, they can be reasonably safe, but they're quite difficult as well. People can slip and fall. As a result of that, some of them will have a protection line or a slip line so that you can climb safely. And if you slip, it'll protect you and stop you there. Okay. Obviously, that's going to lead into, well, if I slip and I'm there, how do I get rescued? And that's another thing. Part of the requirement is we have to put a rescue plan in place for work at heights in the event that someone gets stuck in a position at heights. A-frame ladders. And you're wondering, well, why are A-frame ladders so far down the list when it comes to, because they're bloody dangerous. That's the answer. People don't use them correctly. People tend to, have the wrong ladder with them, and rather than getting the right ladder, they climb up to the second last step or the last step and try and do their job. And it's just, the amount of accidents of ladders are significant. In fairness, if we go back 20 years, we were having massive amount of accidents off ladders. Now, not so many, because in a lot of places, A-frame ladders are not allowed. Or if they are allowed, they're allowed under a permit only, which is quite good. So we've no other choice but use it. When you look at if you get a chance to look at some of the HSA documentation where it talks about ladders, A-frame ladder is for short duration work. And generally for short duration inspection work as opposed to, physical work, you have to maintain 3 points of contact on a ladder at all times: foot, foot, hand, 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 foot, or foot, foot, waist. And the waist shouldn't be above the apex of the ladder. Harness fall arrest. So this is where you're in a position where you've got potential to fall, and you use a harness to, I suppose, arrest that fall and protect you from a severe fall to the ground. There's a lot of issues with regard to ensuring that you select the right type of harness and you anchor it correctly, etc., and you put it on correctly. So there's a course in itself on the safe use of harnesses. But it's very important that people are fully aware of how to use a harness and how to anchor it correctly so that it mitigates the risk in the event that they fall. Again, the harness is subject to inspection on a weekly basis under GA3, and it's also subject to a 6-monthly inspection. The only thing with a harness, it's got a 5-year maximum working life, and that has to be within the shelf life of the harness itself. Harness rope access. So this is your fairly high risk activities, and again, a number of my clients would be involved in this, where they're using rope access to do various bits of work. And again, highly trained, highly skilled, and lots of controls in relation to the equipment. You'll see there's 2 lines. One is the actual line, what we call the live line, and the other one is the safety line. So that one fails, the other one is there. And of course, there has to be a rescue plan in place for them. So, safe system of work for working at heights. This is what the HSA and the legislation says. Listen, can we avoid it? If we can not do it, we don't do it. That's not always possible. If we are going to do it, we must plan it, we must ensure it's supervised, and we must ensure it's safe. We must ensure the equipment is fit for purpose. So it's designed for the purpose that you intend to use it for. And it is capable of achieving. So, for example, if you're getting a scissor lift, and you have work to do, well, it can carry who it needs to carry, it can reach who it needs to reach, and it can get to where it needs to get to enable itself to do that. Yeah. Equipment must be certified by a competent person, so the GA1 must be in place for all work at height equipment. Okay, the scaffold is slightly different because that's on a component basis, so they all go together as a scaffold, and it's inspected as one. A competent person should prepare a written risk assessment. So the risk assessment should assess, well, what are the risks and how are we going to control those? And that should be part of a safe system of work or method statement, which outlines what is the sequence of work and what is the training requirements and who's supervising it, and any issues with weather or environmental conditions, etc. Use equipment that protects the largest number of people in preference to individual equipment. So putting a guardrail around a roof while people are working on a roof is much safer than putting someone on a roof with a harness. Work platforms must have top and intermediate handrails and a toe board. As I explained, your top rail should be at least 950, your mid rail should be in position so there's no gap greater than 470 or 18.5 inches between mid rail and top rail and mid rail and base rail, and a toe board in place to prevent items being kicked off, and that's toe boards 150 or 6 inches. Protect all edges and openings where a fall could occur, so to try to prevent things from falling. Inspect the equipment used for work at heights prior to work and at least every 7 days. Again, I did mention that scaffolds, if they're subject to harsh conditions or alterations or movement, they should be re-inspected. Ensure that operators are competent to use the equipment. Ensure effective supervision is in place. And have a rescue and emergency plan in place in the event that there's a problem. Okay. Obviously, we have to also be aware of people around us, making sure the area around us is clear, etc. And people aren't at risk. So, again, as I say, we could spend 2 or 3 days going through the whole lot of this. So here's a very quick run through of the requirements, and we have looked at the why work at heights is in place, the legislation and guidance, certification and inspection, and the various types of work at height equipment, and a safe system of work for work at heights. So I'm going to take it off record now, and we're going to do a Q&A session if anybody's got any questions, etc. But just to let you know, the next one that we're doing in May is going to be competency is the key to safety. So it's about understanding competency in the workplace and how that can affect positively affect safety if competency is there, and how it can negatively affect safety if competency isn't there. So we'll take this off record first.